Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Matthew Byer, and I am the Museum Education and Engagement Coordinator for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood. The Iowa History 101 webinar series, which focuses on the past lives of Iowans, continues on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar if you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't catch them live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we'll hear all about Iowa's longest running history journal, how it's chronicled the deeds, misdeeds, and accomplishments of our predecessors. We'll also discuss the journal's own 158-year history, some of its most popular and impactful articles, and how the journal is celebrating the 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Megan Card is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not be able to get to all the questions before end of our time. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today, Andrew Klumpp. Andrew Klumpp is the editor of the Annals of Iowa. He's a native of Northwest Iowa and attended Northwestern College before completing his master's degree at Duke University and PhD at Southern Methodist University. He picked up the editor's red pen in January 2020, and in his role, he works closely with historians working on any and all aspects of Iowa history. He administers the State Historical Society's research grants for authors program, which supports innovative new research into Iowa's diverse history every year. His own research specializes in immigration, religion, and internationalism in the 19th century Midwest, and has been published by the Middle West Review, the Association for the Advancement of Dutch American Studies, and before his tenure, even here at the Annals. He's an active member of the Midwestern History Association, American Historical Association, and the Society for U.S. Intellectual History. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Andrew to begin the webinar.
Thanks so much, Matt, and to the museum team here. I'm really delighted to be able to talk a little bit about the history of the Annals. I spend all day, every day, working on the Annals and thinking about the Annals. So it's just so much fun to talk to a different audience and share a little bit of what it is that we're doing and where we've come from. So I just really appreciate you all coming and the opportunity to talk. So I want to start today by asking the question of what actually is the Annals of Iowa. Matt mentioned it's the longest running history journal here in the state of Iowa. What is it? Where did it come from? So just so we all can have maybe something similar to be referencing. And the Annals is the scholarly history journal that's published here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. And it first rolled off the presses in 1863. Which would have been in the middle of the Civil War. And I'll talk a little bit about that later and why I think that matters. But it's been published pretty much nonstop with a few hiatuses for the past 158 years. There were two moments when it has stopped and picked back up again. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, why that happened, how that happened, and where we got to today. Right now, what that looks like, what the Annals is today, is a scholarly history journal that publishes 8 to 10 scholarly history articles every single year, and between 60 and 80 book reviews every year as well. So that means that we're putting out some great scholarship, things that I think are really exciting and interesting. We work with people who take seriously the study of Iowa history, and sometimes those are faculty members at universities here in Iowa or abroad, and sometimes those are interested scholars who are doing great work, but maybe work in another field. I just received a great manuscript from someone who is works at a nonprofit here in Des Moines, but has done some really fascinating research. So we work with scholars who are doing interesting work on Iowa history, no matter where they are working and what they're studying. And so that's a little bit about what we do today. But what we'll talk about in today's conversation during the webinar really is that hasn't always been the case. The Annals has existed alongside other publications. The Annals has done different things at different times. It's always been committed to Iowa history and sharing Iowa history, but it hasn't always done it the same way. And I think that's what makes telling the story of the Annals so interesting, and a way to tell a bunch of different stories, not just about Iowa and statehood, but how the State Historical Society, or the Historical Department, which is another entity that existed for quite some time, how those things supported and did their work earlier in the century, and what that looks like today. And at the end of the conversation too, we'll talk a little bit about where we could go forward. What does the future of the Annals look like? What are some challenges, but also what are some opportunities? So that is what the Annals is. But let's jump back in time a little bit and see where the Annals came from. So how did we get to where we are today? So the beginnings. I've got here a quotation that I think is great, and helps to kind of set the scene. The Annals came about in 1863, and this is a quotation that comes from the statute that created the State Historical Society in 1857. And this is published in the introductory article to the Annals, which was published in 1863, so a few years later. But it helps to give you a sense, I think, of what it is that they were setting out to do with the Annals when they got started. So this statute said that the goal of the society, and by extension the Annals, was to rescue from oblivion the memory of its being Iowa's early pioneers, to obtain and preserve the varieties of their exploits, perils, and hardy adventures, to secure facts and statements relative to the history, genius, and progress or decay of our Indian tribes, to exhibit faithfully the antiquities, past and present resources of Iowa, also to aid in the publication of such collections of the society as the society shall from time to time deem of value and interest. Right, so I just read that quotation that's there for you on the PowerPoint, and that's what's quoted here on this first page of the first issue of the Annals. I think what that does helpfully is it helps us to see that what they wanted to do with this was to collect material, to preserve a story, to make sure that the history was maintained and collected. And the Annals really was, at the beginning, something that was a collection, a miscellaneous collection of tidbits, articles, stories. You had county histories, you had profiles of important people, and everything in between. What we think of today as these kind of developed, careful, scholarly articles that are in the Annals today, that wasn't what was being published. And you can see in the statute that created the Historical Society, and in the way that that's used in the first issue of the Annals, that wasn't what they were aiming to do. They weren't aiming to write a tightly written historical analysis of something like we might do today. They had different aims, and the Annals served a different purpose. So it looked different in 1863. I think it's worth noting that the Annals came about during the Civil War. 1863 was really at the heart of the Civil War. And if it was published in 1863, as an editor, I can tell you they were probably working on it well before in 1862. So this was happening throughout and being conceived of and developed during the Civil War. And I want to read this other quotation for you that comes from this same introductory article, because I think it helps us to see what the stakes were, right? Why it was so important. So I'll read this quotation for you from the slide as well. And it says, "The times indeed are not propitious, as the nation is involved in a most unhappy civil war, the like of which, for extent and atrocity, the world never saw. It is therefore most fit that some pages of current events, illustrative of the character of the people so brave and patriotic, should be recorded, and for the benefit of future generations. In troublous times, these annals of the society are begun. This humble publication is begun relating to a state already illustrious in arms, but destined, it is confidently hoped, to be more illustrious when arms shall yield to peace and prosperity throughout the whole land." And that's a quote from the first editor, S.S. Howe, at the Annals of Iowa from 1863. And what you see here, the image is of the 3rd Iowa Cavalry, which is from our special collections here in Des Moines. And what I want to highlight for you is that these are folks who are aimed at capturing some history, preserving history. And so that's why you're going to see things like diary entries, and you're going to see what we would consider current events, stories about Civil War soldiers, that kind of thing. But what's happening is these men and women are living through a time that they know is historic and have to figure out a way to navigate, but also are hoping that there's a way through. And you see that there at the end, that they're not just trying to capture the war or what led up to the war, but they're trying to do it for the moment when peace returns and prosperity is felt throughout the land, right? And so the Annals, not being what we would call a scholarly history journal or a popular history journal, is very much reflective of this moment when it came about, or that I believe is something that we might argue, right? So for us to understand where the Annals came from, it's helpful to understand the moment in which it was born, which was this kind of really fraught Civil War moment in the United States, which I hope we can see. And there was also this trust that Iowa really was something new, right? Iowa, we're celebrating the 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood this year. And Iowa was young. Iowa was just a few decades old when this was started, not even a few decades old. And so there was that sense that we really were an up and coming state. Dorothy Schweiter's great book calls Iowa the middle land, right? In the middle of the country, kind of average. But these folks did not see Iowa as in the middle. We were the far western expanses, and we were a state that was up and coming. We were going to not be average, we were going to be exemplary and exceptional, right? And so that is the moment. It's the spirit of that kind of pioneer frontier ethos coupled with the kind of fraught nature of the Civil War. So that is the moment, and I think it's important as we understand that. So the Annals, despite these kind of hopes, really has some fits and starts, is what I would say. So it emerges in 1863, and it's published until 1874. And I should note that it's published in Iowa City, right alongside the university there. And it's published by the State Historical Society, which is located in Iowa City. And it does eventually founder. It stops being published in 1874 due to a lack of funding, difficulty finding support. But the editor, again, this is S.S. Howe, comes back and starts it back up again in 1882, and it has a brief run again and a second series until 1884. One of my favorite things I've found, there's a notice here, what you're seeing on the left is a notice from the second series where the editor kind of complains that, or not complains, but notes that there had been an absence and that he promises that won't happen again. And then this quotation, which I find really entertaining, is that this is in later, it kind of starts off as normal. And then in the back, in the editorial notes, he writes, "This number of the Annals is tardily issued, but future numbers will be in season, as the same hindrances will not likely occur," right? So he's explaining to those who are subscribers that it's been a while, but don't worry, it won't happen again, acting as though an 8-year hiatus was just a brief delay in publication. As you can see, though, this second series also struggles financially and with support, and it eventually goes under as well, or goes under, it really stops being published, right? The idea of the Annals is maintained. And at this point, too, I should note that there were other things going on. There's another journal that is founded a little later after the Annals ceases publication called the Iowa Historical Record. And that runs through the late 19th century, and that ends up ending shortly after the turn of the 20th century. But it is to say that there were other things going on. There were other publications vying for that space. What really starts, though, or what kind of enters into the era that we are now, the continuous publication, is with the founding of the third series, which on the last slide, I had the dates. It begins in 1893, and this is with Charles Aldrich. And this is also the moment when the Annals of Iowa moves to Des Moines. So before this, the Annals had been published in Iowa City with the State Historical Society. But in Des Moines, there was also a historical department, which was worked with the state library. And so the historical department at this point restarts the Annals with Charles Aldrich, who is a well-known and important figure in Iowa history in his own And so what we see here, and this is a quotation from Aldrich, which I'll also read for you, that highlights why it is he thought this was important to restart the annals. He says, "It was, however, deemed judicious to retain the name Annals of Iowa. In reviving the publication, it will be our aim not only to fill its pages with the best articles we can obtain upon all topics of Iowa history, but to render it as useful as possible in the building up of the Department of History," which again, that was the department that was being founded in Des Moines at the time. Now in its first year of its organization in the capital, we enter upon this work with much misgiving, with deep regret that this work had not been commenced under able and zealous management 40 years about, but with determination to make our labors as valuable as possible to the state. And so that's a quotation from Aldrich, who is saying that he had wished that this had been able to be sustained earlier, but wanted to then take this on to begin here in Des Moines. And there was a hope as well that while the State Historical Society was operating in Iowa City, that by moving the annals to Des Moines, there might be more consistent support for the publication itself. So I should note that the State Historical Society continues to operate and develop and function very robustly in Iowa City, but in conjunction with, but distinct from the historical department. And I'm not an expert on the history of those two departments, but it is to say that the annals moves over to Des Moines at this point in hopes that there might be some more support, at least financially, for it. And this is a period really, and going back to earlier, that historian Joseph Wall called the pioneer period, with gentlemen historians, right? So the folks who are writing in the annals are doing exactly what we discussed earlier. They're writing reminiscences. They are writing kind of pioneer stories, capturing the stories of Civil War veterans. These are things that are important to this era of historian. It really defines this period as well. So as you think about what is the annals, what's happening in the annals in these early periods, it is being led by these folks who remember being pioneers in Iowa, or have heard stories from their parents or grandparents about that and want to capture those stories for posterity, right? And the same goes for the Civil War, right? So this is really a new era, but it's a very different era than the one we find ourselves living in now, with very different goals. It's also, I should note though, that while the Annals is doing this work, there are some sister publications that are operating, and these are based out of Iowa City, but they're filling important roles. So one of the major ones, not pictured here, is the Iowa Journal of History and Politics. And this really is the journal that is doing the kind of scholarly, hard-hitting work that maybe we would associate with the Annals today. So this is a Journal of History and Politics, and later it becomes just a Journal of History. It's founded in 1903, and it continues until 1961. And so this is a journal that many of the articles are still very important and reliable resources today. That's doing that kind of scholarly work. And so the Annals doesn't need to fill that kind of space, right? And Benjamin Shambaugh, a really significant figure in Iowa history. You can read about him as well in a number of articles and a wonderful book by Rebecca Conard. But he serves as editor for many years of the Iowa Journal of History and Politics that's doing that work. And alongside that, you also, though, have the palimpsest, which comes about in 1920. And you can see some of the more recent covers here on the slide. And the palimpsest comes about in 1920, and it really is a popular history magazine. And so that is the kind of magazine that's going to be read by those who are looking for a more casual or approachable entry point into Iowa's history, if you will, right? So this journal exists for nearly a century, being founded in 1920 and continuing until 2014. It later takes the name Iowa Heritage Illustrated. But what's happening, and why I think it's important to mention these two journals, is that the Annals is doing something different. The Annals, what it does today, is very much made possible by the fact that the Iowa Journal of History and Politics eventually is no longer published, and there's an opening for a kind of scholarly academic journal, right? So these sister journals are an important part of the larger ecosystem of publications of Iowa history that are happening at this point in the early 20th century and into the later part of the 20th century. And I think that's useful. as we kind of situate the history of the Annals itself, is that the Annals was always, or for most of its history, a part of a dynamic network of people who are seriously thinking and writing about Iowa history. And I have to be honest and say that I get to do that every day, work with people who are thinking and writing about Iowa history. And so I think this is also, it's important for us to see that this was really happening in the public sphere with different journals doing different, serving different communities with different interests. And I think that's really a part of the story of the Annals, is to say that we as a journal have not been a vacuum, but we've very much existed alongside other journals. And there have been others, other journals that have existed, especially during this time period. There were university presses, and there were lots of great books published as well. I just mentioned these journals in particular because they're standouts, and I think they are ones that help to orient us in our history of the Annals, that really during this period, the Annals is publishing these kinds of miscellaneous stories. You're going to get obituaries of famous Iowans at this point. You're going to have those reminiscences. You're also going to have, during this period, diary entries, for example. If, let's say, I've used one of these in the past myself, a diary entry of a Dutch immigrant would potentially be published in the Annals at this point, edited maybe by a scholar or someone. But these kinds of things, right? So what we would call published primary sources. There's a great, there's an article that my predecessor, Marvin Bergman, wrote, and that'll be in the resources that are sent out to those in attendance today, that talks about this great article about, that's written from the perspective of an old house, talking about the things that the house had seen, right? So it's fictional. The history is likely accurate, but the anthropomorphizing, if you will, of the house certainly is not something we would publish today. But the Annals is doing that work along, and its sister journals are doing other work that that is serving different audiences, but kind of a cross section as well. So I say all of that. We get this history of the Annals, where it comes from with the Civil War, this kind of collecting and preserving and chronicling of Iowa history that kind of moves forward through pioneer historians and gentleman historians and existing alongside other journals. But that really changes in 1972. Some important things that happened before and after that. One is that the Iowa Journal of History ceases publication in 1961. With the editor, she passed away somewhat unexpectedly, and when trying to decide what to do with the Iowa Journal of History, the director at the time chose to focus on the palimpsest rather than the Iowa Journal of History. And so the Journal of History ceases publication. And that was a really important place for people who were doing scholarly work on Iowa history to publish their research. And during this period of the 1960s, occasionally you start seeing some of those folks migrate over to the Annals, because remember, the Annals hadn't been that for that entire time. And what really happens is there's this opening in the market, if you will, an opening in this space. And then you have a new editor come up, a new editor pick up the red pen at the Annals, and she sees an opportunity. Her name is Judith Gildner, and she became editor of the Annals in 1972. And that she sees that the Annals can fill this space, creating an opportunity for scholars to study and research Iowa history, and have a place for them to publish their material, right? And so she takes this and pushes forward. She introduces a new format. So if you go back to an earlier issue of the Annals, you're going to see kind of, sometimes there's one article, sometimes there's four, sometimes there's a bunch of obituaries or editorial notes, which are really miscellaneous. She introduces a format that has one or two, sometimes more, articles that are written by scholars and a book review section. And she really introduces the concept of gender as well. So she has gender, which was also happening in the larger historical profession, but you have more women authors, and women are featured more prominently in the history that's done. And so she really begins this push in 1972. Another editorial change happens in 1980 with Christy Daly taking over for Judith Gildner after her retirement, or after actually Gildner moved on to a faculty position at a university. And so Christy Daly, in a lot of ways, takes over and continues the work that Gildner was doing with scholarly review, scholarly articles. She does a lot more with race as well, introducing race as an important topic. And this is the 1980s, which is also when academic historians are largely pivoting and engaging with concepts of race and the history of non-white people more rigorously. And so this is an important moment as well, in as much as she's expanding the content that's discussed and continuing to build on that pivot that Gildner had taken place. During this period as well, we see that the Annals moves back to Iowa City in the 1980s as well. So after just about 90 years in Des Moines, the Annals moves back to Iowa City, which joins it alongside the publications that are there at the time, which is the Palimpsest and at that point the Goldfinch. So you have all the publications happening in the same time. So for a long time you had these two publications, two different centers, and in the 80s you see them coming together in Iowa City and the Annals coming back over. And then the next editorial change also continues to build. So what we see here in what I would call the new era is this building, if you will, of the Annals, and continuing to become more and more rigorous and more engaged in that kind of scholarly identity that it's building for itself. And that was in 1987 when my immediate predecessor, Marvin Bergman, took over. And he would serve as editor for 33 years and really expand the topics that are covered by scholars, pushing people to be more rigorous in their analysis and helping really to move the journal to being a premier scholarly journal for our state, but also for the region in the Midwest and in the nation, with the Annals of Iowa being a really award-winning journal, not just here in Iowa, but is recognized frequently by scholarly associations well beyond our state's border. And that identity really comes into its own under Marv Bergman, and has a really well-developed reputation for taking seriously the work that we do in sharing and writing Iowa history. And I think that's really critical to understanding how we got to today. And so that during Marv's tenure, you also see kind of an increasing conversation, right? More and more topics being discussed and really being unafraid to discuss and explore through history things that are important to understanding our state, but are not often studied. So you'll see articles about prostitution here in Des Moines, things like that, right? These are not topics that many people are clamoring to study, but are critical to understanding. And so Bergman really does a great job of empowering scholars to ask tough questions about interesting topics and not being afraid to really study parts of our past that are interesting, important, but not always the most shiny and pretty or easiest to get a hold of. And so we see that real development. There's also a real growth in our studies of labor history and other communities, not just the Black community in Iowa, but the Latinx community in Iowa is really begins to be a part of the study and the history that we're telling stories about all parts of Iowa as well, moving well beyond our cities to tell rural stories and to tell urban stories, right? I think there's just a real kind of dynamism and excitement to the work that has happened in the Annals in the past 50 years, and I would say in the past 30 years. So that is where we have landed today. And so what is the future of the Annals? I'm the editor. I get asked this question a lot, and I'll say one of the things that's happening in the future with the Annals is we have a special issue of the Annals coming out in October. It's our fall issue that we've brought together some really dynamic and interesting scholars. We have familiar faces, people that readers of the Annals and lovers of Iowa history will know well, and we have some new faces as well. And these are folks who I've asked a simple question. What is the importance of Iowa history? Where has it been and where is it going? And we have some great articles that not only help us to see where we've been, a lot of the history that I've outlined today and even more really will be covered in Rebecca Conard's great article that will be featured in this issue where she talks about the publication of Iowa history. But you also have some great content from Pam Riney-Kerberg, who's talking about the importance of state and local history in a globalizing world, right? We're often reminded that we live in this kind of global environment, but why are we studying state history? She gives a great answer that I really think hits at so much of what we're doing. But these people also ask great questions about where can we go? What hasn't been done? What is next? And I hope that we continue to be a real scholarly journal. And what we have in this issue is a great kind of combination of folks who are saying in agricultural history, Iowa has done great work, but here's some things that need to be done. In the study of Iowa before it was a state, this is what could be done. Or in the study of gender, race, politics, the Civil War era, here's what's been done and here's what remains. If you asked me, okay, Andrew, thanks, this is really inspiring. I have a new project. What can we do? What should be done? I think one of the things that really could be studied is Iowa's Asian and Asian American community, right? These are communities that have been a part of Iowa at least since, for quite some time, but prominently since the Robert Ray administration. And the Annals hasn't done a lot of work on the Asian and Asian Americans who are living in our state, and it's a growing population. I also think that we need to study more recent history of Iowa. I hope that the Annals continues to study more and more recent history. As weird as it is sometimes, as someone who remembers the 1990s and the early 2000s, it's time to start studying them as serious historical events. And the Annals has never been afraid of that, of studying things. And really in its earlier iterations, as I mentioned, it did more current events. And I'm not saying the Annals will become a current events journal. It will not. We'll still do Iowa history, but Iowa history continues to happen and we continue to move forward. But we can also begin to move back, telling histories that happened before, earlier in Iowa history as well. I think these are opportunities to discuss and to share parts of Iowa history. And another thing that's important to me is that we continue to tell history for all Iowans in all parts of Iowa. I have a map on my desk that shows where we have discussed, that it has all the counties, and different counties are different shades. And I hope that we continue to tell the whole story of Iowa. I look at the map, if I look at it right now, there's parts of Southwest Iowa in particular that we need to research more, that there are more opportunities. I grew up in Northwest Iowa, full disclosure, and I grew up often being told that we never got enough attention, or often feeling like we never got enough attention. And the Annals has written some great pieces about Northwest Iowa, and there are some more in the pipeline, I can tell you. But there are parts of the state, there are communities in the state that haven't gotten that attention. And I hope that scholars will continue to kind of dig into those areas and ask those questions, and also to ask new questions, things that I haven't thought of. I remembered having a great conversation with Mark Bergman before, as we were transitioning, and he said, some of my favorite articles are those that surprise me, the topics that I never would have thought to explore, the things that I never would have gone after or suggested someone to go after, that are really exciting and revelatory. And that has continued to happen for me. We've published articles, or I've heard research proposals from people who are doing fascinating work. Just this morning, I was emailing with a scholar who was doing work on cookbooks. And I would never think to use a cookbook as a research tool, but she had done this really fascinating analysis of recipes by women in cookbooks. So interesting, right? So where is the Annals going in the future? I hope that, I don't know exactly. I hope that we are a rigorous and engaging and participatory history journal that is open to what surprises us in the future, to all kinds of really thoughtful and careful historical research in new ways that we maybe even can't think of yet. That's part of the hope and part of what I hope to bring to building on the legacy of the last 50 years here at the Annals, and the work that it does. Now, as we're kind of wrapping up, but before we get to questions, I want to highlight too, just what that future also includes. One of the things that has changed about the Annals since the early 2000s is the internet. And the Annals is still a print journal. You can see here that we still print the Annals much like we always used to. So this is an example of one of the earlier, if you can see my screen, one of the earliest issues, very slim. And this is the most recent issue, which is a little bit more robust. But I think one of the things that's changed is we're able to reach our audience in a variety of ways. We still have a wonderful and dedicated subscriber list who gets these print issues, and I'm grateful for those folks. But we're also really engaging with people on the internet. So since 2014, when everything went online, we've had 1.75 million downloads of Annals articles. And in last year alone, is a number in the parentheses, which is 417,000 downloads of our articles in 2020. So we are seeing all kinds of engagement and downloads with our journal today, even though we don't it's all on the internet, right? We see these things since 2014, people have downloaded our journal from 227 countries. Last year, we had 220 countries downloading our content. So it isn't just the United States, and it's not just Iowa. Admittedly, the United States is the country that downloads the most of our articles, and Iowa is the state that is best represented in those who are downloading our materials. But we also have large numbers from China and the United Kingdom. Those numbers are about the same. And then Canada, France, and Germany are also downloading our material. And so there are people reading stories of Iowa from all over the world. I think that's really exciting and opens up the possibilities, ideas, what could be done, what should be done, what does it look like to go forward in the future with the Annals with so many opportunities. And then I promised in the description to have some of the most popular articles from the Annals. And you can see here as you read the slide that there's a real variety there, right? So what you see is the most popular article, and it consistently is so month in and month out, is Outstanding Iowa Storms, which discusses kind of stories of storms in Iowa, right? It's coming from 1970 though, and that's important to note. That's that moment, right, where we talked about earlier, where this is more anecdotal reminiscences, trying to capture some important storms in Iowa's history, right? This is not the analysis you might associate with the Annals today. The next one is Jorge Garcia's Herbert Hoover and the Issue of Race, which was published in 1979. Now, to our conversation earlier, right? This is when we're moving toward more discussion of race, as I discussed earlier in the timeline, and this is when Judith Gildner is the editor, right? So we've moved into more kind of academic topics, kind of interpretive analysis, and you can see there that both of these continue to be popular, but as you can read the titles, you can see a little bit the difference, right? There's a very difference. You can tell even just by the title, there's a different kind of approach to what's being done. Our third most popular is an obituary, Hugh Forbes, Soldier of Fortune. So, and you can see that's from 1967. That was that period when we had more of the miscellaneous content, right? Another very popular one is Mennonite Family Names. This is, again, more of a miscellaneous piece. I think what I want to highlight about this, though, is it helps you see who's reading in some ways. This is the Annals, especially our earlier issues, are great for genealogists, those who with an interest in finding their families or tracking families, putting together biographies. The Annals has wonderful information, especially earlier on, right, when it was serving some of these different purposes or taking on different tasks. And then the fifth most downloaded article is a much more recent one from 2002, and it's by really the Dean of Iowa Historians, Dorothy Schweeder, who really was the leading historian of Iowa throughout her life. And it's a really impactful article called A Farmer and the Ku Klux Klan in Northwest Iowa. And this is a frequently cited article in academic publications here at the Annals. It really is a landmark piece. And it's also one of these downloads. So I highlight these numbers, one, because I think they're really surprising and impressive, just how many people are engaging, but also it shows what it looks like to engage with the Annals going forward. Part of it is that the work that we do, it lasts a long time. It will outlive us, and it also continues to be relevant, and different parts of our work continues to be relevant. Some of the new research, academic histories are really richly engaged, but so too are some of these other resources that are really serving a broader purpose. So those are some of the numbers. That is where the Annals is. And as I mentioned, going forward, we are open to all kinds of opportunities. And this special issue of the Annals that we have coming out in October really kind of highlights that, and it highlights opportunities for partnership. We're going to be featuring some wonderful art by Iowa artists in some inserts and a special cover design. So really the opportunities are there for continuing to do this work, and we can show that there are people who are really interested in it. And all of these online articles, I should mention too, are freely available online. And so we're grateful for that, for people being able to engage with our work. And so one of the things that I want to end with, or the idea that I want to end with, is really that the Annals has been through through a lot. It's made it through good times and bad, right? I was talking to someone the other day, and I mentioned that the Annals, has made it through the Civil War, which is when it started. It's made it through 2 world wars. It's made it through now its second pandemic. It's been through the Great Depression, the farm crisis, 9/11. It's been through hard times, but it's been through good ones too. The Roaring Twenties, many state fairs, really developing and flourishing days for publications, for research, our universities growing and developing, and the growth of our state. The Annals has been here through the good times. It's been here through the hard times. And our hope is that it continues on into the future, telling the story of Iowa history, and sharing this story with Iowans, not only to inspire, but also to challenge, and to move forward together as people. As we face obstacles today, the Annals can teach us about what's happened in the past. And I think that role is still vitally important, and one that we really work hard to serve here well. So we've been through it, and we will continue to be here moving forward in the future. I'm really excited about what's ahead, and this history, I hope, is inspiring to you as it is inspiring to me. And with that, though, that's all I've got for now. I love conversation and questions, so I will turn it over for questions. We've got plenty of time, and I would love to answer any all the questions that you have for me. So thanks for being here again. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed our chat.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So as Matt said in the beginning, my name is Megan Card. I'm the Digital Education Coordinator at the State Historical Society, and I'll be kind of asking your questions to Andrew today. So please feel free to putting them in the Q&A feature. So thank you so much, Andrew, for presenting today. We have a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. However, before I pose the first question, I want to remind our participants that you can submit your questions to the Q&A feature. We are on a schedule, so please note we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the webinar. But the first one, the question I kind of wanted to ask you was, I'm thinking about kind of the legacy of Annals over such an illustrious, legacy and heritage. When you're putting together something like, 175th, commemorative special edition, or even just in the process of trying to curate just an edition in general, what's the process like? I can't imagine, just kind of wading through so many options and great scholars. What's that like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's challenging putting together a special issue. And I was relatively new on the job. I took the red pen over from Marv Bergman in January, and we pretty quickly got this issue started. I think part of it was asking the question, where has Iowa history been and where is it going? And trying to put together a special issue that looked at topics that have been discussed while also being pretty clear-eyed about the fact that we're not going to be able to cover everything. And I am a relatively young historian. I would never call myself young. I know who I am, but among historians, I am on the younger side. And so what we did when we kind of put together this list was look at people at all stages in their careers. So we have some really heavy-hitting Iowa historians who have been a part of this work for decades. And we also have some newer voices. And so part of the challenge was to put together a volume that brings together people who have these different perspectives. And I think we did a nice job of balancing it. There are so many wonderful folks working in Iowa history that I wish we could have had space for everyone. But it was kind of trying to decide which folks to bring in. And if someone wasn't invited, it wasn't a slight by any means. It was more so looking at, for example, we have a wonderful essay on Iowa's political history, and invited a scholar of political history to write that short piece for us. And so it was kind of, here is a topic we want to talk about. Who would be the best fit for this? Or where are there opportunities to bring in another voice, a new voice, that kind of thing. So that was a lot of what went into it. It's bringing together a diverse community of scholars who have different perspectives, because younger historians are going to have different perspectives than, say, a more established historian. And I wanted to have that kind of dynamism to that issue. So that's largely what went into it. But this work started over a year and a half ago. So building this issue takes a long time, to give people the time to do that work, to do that research. And engage richly with it. So does that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah, because it's such a process. And I know, working, for the State Historical Society, I work with a lot of teachers, and there's a lot that, people ask for a very general topic, and there's so much to go through and everything. So that's really insightful. Another question someone asked that is kind of interesting, when you showed, where most downloads, some of the countries where you see a lot of downloads from, and someone says, do you have any insight as to why China, for instance, is second in downloads? It's kind of a interesting, or any of those countries that you also saw listed.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't prove anything. So I'll say this with the disclaimer that this is just me trying to piece things together. One thing that really helps China is how many people live there. So they just have more people to do more downloading. But I think there are also parts of real kind of a couple things. I think I would think about is ready access to English language sources, that kind of thing. So if you are, I know that from personal relationships in my life, folks who are learning English in a Chinese speaking country, are looking for ways to make sure that their English is up to speed. So there is that element of this is a great source for someone who is wanting to hone materials, but also there's a lot of universities, a real focus on education. And so if someone is studying Iowa or studying American history or trying to get a sense of certain things, this is again a really easily accessible and an available source, right? That is available to someone all the way across on the other side of the world. So I think that's also a part of it, is that we are encouraging folks to engage with Iowa history from all over the world. There's no paywall. So a lot of journals require you to pay for something, or they're not as easily discoverable. And so we have all those things working for us as well. So I think that kind of that push toward education is a part of it. Some of the bigger universities, the sheer number of people. Then I also think this for someone who wants to learn about the United States, but also maybe is working on their English, this could be a great source as well. I don't know any of those things for sure, but if you asked me to do some pontificating, which I guess you did, those would be some of the things maybe I would suggest.
For sure. I have a question here from Marjorie, and she says, from your perspective, from some of the original issues of the Annals, what do you feel is the most interesting, or do you have any that really stick out to you as something you read that really was just really intriguing?
Yeah, I love the early. I'm an editor. So I love some of the earlier ones where the editor is talking about why they're doing what they're doing. So that kind of introductory article, I love going back to that. I think it's so great. Or Charles Aldrich has an introductory article in his kind of rebooting of the Annals in 1893. So I think those are interesting to me. I'm really interested in some ways, and this is me with my historian hat on, where I'm a researcher in some of the ways that Native Americans are discussed, indigenous communities, and thinking about what's happening there, what kind of stories are being told. And the pioneer histories are also really interesting because people, when they write history, often have a story they're trying to tell. And that story may or may not be accurate to what happened, and we know that. And so it's interesting to see, how is this being told, or what's being accomplished by this kind of thing. I like thinking about that. I think about that with some of the family histories I've heard, right? And we know that Uncle Barney actually did something, but we like telling a story about having a really rugged ancestor, so we say he didn't have plumbing, right? And we all kind of know that. I'm not saying that exactly happens here at the Annals, but it's interesting to think like, oh, what's the story that's being told behind this? So those pioneer histories, those early histories of indigenous communities, the editorial notes, those are ones I really like. Another thing, if you're looking to kind of dig into some of those, that I think is really fun to do, and this again probably makes me seem like a really nerdy historian, is to look for communities that are discussed across time, so you can see maybe how certain places are being studied. I grew up in Northwest Iowa, Bryan County, but Sioux County and the Dutch are often talked about, right? So I like reading about, oh, this is how we're talking about the Dutch in, say, 1912 in the Annals or in another publication. And now we're talking about them a little bit differently in 1960. And then in 1980, we're talking about them differently, right? The history has gotten more complex. Different people are writing it. And we're getting different stories. So that if you're looking for a place to dive in, that might be something too. Look for a place that's close to your home, and then maybe see if, how the history has developed or changed, or the new parts are told. That's some of the stuff I love to do, and to remember what's going on. So I love reading that first issue, and remembering that these are folks who don't know yet that the North will win the Civil War, like the Union's going to win. They think the Union's going to win, but they don't know that yet. And so that's interesting, right? That's really interesting to me when you can put yourself in those moments, or reading things during World War I or World War II, realizing like this is being published and these people live in a very different moment in time than we do. So that's a lot of different ways, I guess, into it, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to get started. And then Marilyn has a question about, you mentioned a map that shows where research has been done. Is this available for the public to see?
So it's not available. And that's just because it's a map I just made. And what it is really from my time starting here. So it's not at all comprehensive. It's something that could be really useful. It would take quite a bit of work to put that together. But no, so that map is something that I do for my own interest. It's important to me. I mentioned that I grew up in Northwest Iowa. And so I always, I wanted our story to be told. I grew up in a very small rural town. And so it was important to me to kind of track to make sure that we're telling stories from all over the state of Iowa. So, I mean, it's really just this, that is the last year and a half, right? Where we've talked about. So that's a long way of saying, no, it's not available, because it's just something I whipped up, a few weeks ago or a few months ago. And that was for my purposes, but I think it's a great idea. It's something that I could explore what it would take to build and make that available, because I think it could be really useful, especially for local historical societies. But yeah, that's the origin of it, has been and where we're at.
It's a great suggestion. I'm glad they mentioned that it's a good thing.
I think it could be really interesting. It would take a lot of work, but it could also be really interesting, and it would allow some of those things. If you want to study, say, how have communities in Mills County been studied in the past, you could do that. You could follow those stories much more easily.
Something really cool, people haven't, I put in our chat, as well as a Q&A, links to where you can see the Annals of Iowa, some older editions available online, as well as other publications. So those are in there for folks to look at. And then also within there, you can, I believe, at least for Annals, you can actually, when you pull up the site, it'll show you where people are currently at, where they're looking at versions of the publication. So that's kind of cool. If you're just curious where like some people are seeing, who's looking at stuff right now, you can actually see where they're at. Another question from Marjorie, and again, she said this might be more of a historical society question. She says, I know in New York, every town has a historian. Does Iowa have that as well? And I think it's an interesting question of, I think there's a lot of counties that have historical societies that come to mind. But I guess with your work, kind of reaching out to folks and getting, in your work with the Annals, kind of, what has been your kind of view of how Iowa has kind of local history is stored, and who's kind of the gatekeepers of it?
Yeah, it really depends. It really varies. I was just on the phone earlier this week with a gentleman who was wanted to give something to a local society, and in the particular county he was looking at, the best option was going to be a museum. They didn't have a really robust historical society. I think it existed in name, but it wasn't really doing much. But then there was a museum that was a good fit, and so there really isn't kind of a universal there isn't something universal like that. We have a great local history network that often does a lot of good work of connecting local historians, and that looks different in county to county. So there's a lot of variety here in Iowa, and it looks like museums, it looks like county historical societies, but that work is being done in a variety of ways. And a lot of times, I think the Historical Society does our work in trying to connect people with those societies, whether that's my colleague, Mike Plummer, who helps to engage with the local history network, or my work in helping scholars get connected. Oh, well, you want this? Well, there's a great local history, the Historical Society over here. They might have something you're looking for, that kind of thing, right? So there isn't something that's universal that I'm aware of. It really varies county to county. Often it's a historical society. Sometimes it's a museum. Sometimes it might be a college that does a lot of that work as well, or a local university. So there's nothing uniform in my knowledge, but the work is being done, and it varies a lot by community.
Sure, and we're getting pretty close to the end of our time. For folks who are interested about the conversation about or about subscribing to the Annals for the future, I put the link in the chat as well as in the Q&A for people to check out. When they subscribe, do you get a physical version and an online option, or does that come later?
So it's a physical version. Everyone gets a physical version, and then the online option is available for everyone a year later. So everyone has access to everything online. If for some reason you needed or want, let's say you got your physical version and you said, hey, I'm a subscriber and I really want a PDF copy of this, just email me. I'm accessible. You can find my email pretty easily on our website. So just send me an email and we could work that out. So if there were to be a need for that, we could work something like that out. But it starts physical, and then a year later, everything goes online.
Awesome. Valerie's question really quick. She asks, are you open to unsolicited scholarly manuscripts on Iowa topics, or should writers query you first?
Yes, please. Send me stuff. I get all kinds of stuff, and I love reading it. And so please, send anything you're working on. We are scholarly, and we do a peer review of everything. So that means it goes out blind to experts in the field. So oftentimes it's pretty rigorous, or it is very rigorous. And oftentimes when you send something to me, it will get sent back at least once or twice for revision. But yes, I am open to unsolicited advice. And we also, I forgot to mention, but Matt mentioned at the beginning, the grant program. If you're doing work on Iowa history, I also help facilitate a grant program that gives money once a year to people who wanted to work on academic, scholarly writing and projects, that kind of thing. So there are other grants for local history societies, historic preservation. These aren't the grants for that, but if you want to write a manuscript that is written, in the style and substance of a scholar, or it was befitting of the Annals, we've got grants for you. So you can find all that on the website as well. And I'm happy to work with that too. So Valerie or anyone else listening, you're welcome to do unsolicited, send me an email, or think about maybe a grant if you have a project that isn't quite there yet, but you want to keep working on. Those can be really useful. I got one before I started as editor, and it was awesome. I had a great experience with it.
Andrew, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up here with that question, and we'll bring the webinar to a close. I think we can all agree this has been a really informative lunch. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For information about and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on the website as well. And while you're there, there's also lots of great other fantastic digital programs, such as Goalie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or you can watch video recordings of the Iowa Story series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to virtually seeing you all Thursday, August 26th for our next Iowa History 101 webinar. It's entitled Soldier, Mob, and Keokuk, Violence Against the Press During the American Civil War. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.